Hey everyone, in today's video I'll be sharing with you one of my games to show you how you can play the London system in a much more aggressive way, and if you don't want to play the London system, how you can basically build winning attacks and go on to checkmate your opponents. So looking at the game, it starts out with a normal London system development ideas, and here my opponent offers an early trade of dark squared bishops, and I simply drop back with the idea of basically if he wants to trade he has to take me and I get to take back with my h-pawn and open up a semi-open file for my rook. And if he doesn't want to take, he simply has to continue developing and I get to keep my dark squared bishop there. And next idea is basically I centralize my knight on e5, and here it's important to basically put your pieces on active squares if you want to sort of build an attack. So here my knight was fine on f3, but the chance of putting it on e5 was there, and my knight would just be more active, looking at more squares like the f7, g6, whatnot, and basically more closer to black's king to create an attack in the future. So the game goes on and I develop the bishop to d3, again basically looking at the diagonal in which the opponent's king is located in. Rather than playing a passive move like bishop to e2, bishop to d3 is basically much more active for building an attack. So again, the first really tip is about finding ways to develop your pieces to the really active squares closer to your opponent's king if you want to sort of create an attack in the future. So here I play f4, again further centralizing my knight on e5 and keeping an eye on the e5 square, so if a trade does happen, let's say a move like bishop takes e5, I can take back with the f-pawn, and this only opens up the f file for my rook in the future, and it also allows me to continue building an attack. Or perhaps I can even take with the d-pawn honestly, and I'll play c3 to prevent any d-pawn pushes and keep my pawn structure together, and with the f4 pawn I can perhaps move my bishop and then use the f4 pawn to launch my g and h pawns forward. So there are options here to build an attack, and f4 is a pretty nice start. So my opponent here plays b6 and he simply hangs a pawn. Now I just take it and I go back, and for the purpose of this video I'll continue to show the game like I'm not up a pawn, because here I really want you to get the tips on basically how to create a winning attack rather than trying to convert winning positions. So here my opponent plays a5 and I immediately realize that he wants bishop a6 because his light squared bishop is basically passive, it's stuck behind the pawn chain. Meanwhile mine is nicely placed, it's active, and it's towards his king. Now the reason why I realized this quickly is through experience. I've allowed bishop a6 many times and I usually had to end up trading my light squared bishops, and usually that isn't the best way to attack. And in this position I realized bishop a6 was a threat to be dealt with, and I played queen e2. So now another tip is, not only do you want to develop your pieces to active squares, you usually don't want to trade them off and also keep your opponent's pieces basically passive, so it's easier for you to attack your opponent's king. Now of course you won't get this chance always, but when you do, make sure you don't allow your opponent to basically get active, and make sure you preserve your pieces as well. And in this position that's what I do. I keep my light squared bishop, and here my opponent plays h6, sort of a waiting move per se, and I just continue with c3, building the strong London system pawn chain, what it's known for. And I'm basically planning to move my dark squared bishop next move and push forward with the pawns and create some sort of attack. So here my opponent goes back with his knight, and this is a sign that he wants to play f6 and try to kick my knight from the e5 square. But really I continue with my plan, because once he plays f6, again I jump into his position with knight g6. Now this is another tip that I would like to share to you, and it's basically when you develop your squares to when you develop your pieces to active squares and you basically sort of restrict your opponent, that's when he tries to get desperate and does funny stuff like play knight h7, further making his knight passive, trying to play f6, and all this does is create more weaknesses, and this is when you have to capitalize on them. And here the knight is on g6 and the dark squares are pretty weak around the black king, and he really has no way to now get rid of my knight. And not to mention, if he plays f5 trying to cut my knight out from the light squared bishop's defense, I simply can just go back to the e5 because pawns can't move backward and the pawn is no longer on f6. So here my opponent plays rook f7, first defending his rook, and I continue with g4, and playing g5 right now perhaps isn't an idea, but it is in the case where he does move his f pawn forward. I could consider pushing g5 or taking on f5, or if he doesn't do any of those, I can simply drop back with the bishop and then play h4. So there are a couple of ideas, but I start with g4, and here my opponent plays knight f8 back, trying to trade off the knights, but I continue with knight f3, bringing more of my pieces into the attack. And here he really can't trade because I end up winning the exchange as the rook is pinned to the queen. And another important thing I would like to mention is I don't rush with pushing my pawns forward. Like I did mention earlier that I would like to move my dark square bishop and push my h pawn and so on, but that is an idea. But in this position I realized I have to bring more pieces to attack, and usually this is the important thing I would say, especially if you're not over 2000 and you don't have too much experience having successful attacks. It's basically you want to bring as many pieces as you can to the party and basically create an attack with all those pieces together. If you look in this position, this knight isn't doing much, my rook on a1 isn't doing much, and my rook on h1 isn't doing much. So I wanted to bring all these pieces basically towards the king side as well, and then sort of make a pawn break, so when the position opens up I can use all these pieces at once together and basically have a successful attack, rather than opening up the position right now and then trying to bring my pieces, because then that allows black some sort of time to escape. And this is what I really noticed from my previous games. Like every single time when I attacked I used to end up failing, and this is the main reason why. First you bring your pieces and then you open up the position in general to have a successful attack. So in this position I bring my knight to f3, and now he plays f5 and I simply retreat back to e5 as I mentioned before. Here there's a trade, and now you see my other knight is getting active as well. I removed his dark square bishop, which wasn't too active per se, but it was a piece that was developed and basically could have worked to defend by dropping back to e7 or somewhat, because it is one of his more active pieces. Like look at this rook and light squared bishop. So I do end up bringing my other knight, getting rid of his dark squared bishop, and here my opponent plays rook c7, again basically defending his rook from my knight. And I continue again with the idea of developing all my pieces and bringing them to the attack. And here my opponent plays knight d7, and now as you see he's trying to trade some pieces off, and that is a general rule of thumb when you're trying to defend. Basically trade some sort of piece off and your opponent will have less pieces to attack with. And in this case I realized I had no way to avoid it. Like I could go back with my knight, but in that case I'm just undeveloping him and I'm giving my opponent more time to basically sort of fix his issues with his pieces. So rather than that, I first take on f5 now, and I do open up a position a little bit to basically align my rook with the black king, basically creating some sort of danger, not like a tangible threat, but just like, you know, psychologically, like I'm opening up the file, my rook is there and I'm trying to divert him, and I'm only a couple of moves from bringing my other rook in as well. And here my opponent first trades the knights and then takes back, and here I play king d2, and I don't castle queenside because then I would be aligning my king directly with the rook. Of course I can play king b1, but then like I do allow him to start pushing his pawn, and basically I allow him to give a chance to create counterplay and basically divert the tension. And I realized I should rather just bonk out my king and not to a square like f2, because then I'm getting in the way of my own pieces from creating an attack, and my king would only be a weakness, because then perhaps if he also brings his pieces to the f file, my king would be exposed. Rather I just play king d2, where it's not too close to the queen side, not too close to the king side, and it's safe enough where black can't create any counterplay, and I bring my rook to the other side as well. So it's important where you decide where you place your king. You just don't aimlessly play a move like queenside castle and then regret because you allow your opponent to basically have a bunch of counterplay. So here I play king d2, and here my opponent continues developing his pieces, and with rook f1 now I basically activated all my pieces, and now I'm basically threatening to take on f5 and basically bring in my queen as well in the future. And here my opponent plays queen d7, protecting the f5 pawn. Now that allows my queen to come to h5 as I was looking at it earlier. And here I also have another threat of trying to take on h6, as earlier I opened up the file for my rook. And here my opponent plays rook f8, trying to defend the f5 pawn, and I simply take on h6. And yes, my opponent didn't play the most accurate way. However, at the end of the day, my opponent, he's just a human as well, and under pressure he will crumble. And this is what happens if you slowly develop all your pieces and then open up the position and then start to make threats. Your opponents will eventually crumble and you'll start to slowly build a winning attack. And in this case, I win another pawn, and I still have threats against the opponent's king, and potentially I'll basically double up to create more attack. And here now he decides to create counterplay, and as I mentioned before, if my king was on c1, it would be much more alarming, because he would be playing b4 next, and the rook is directly aligned with my king, and he could perhaps get some tempo with checks and bring in his queen with tempo. But here I simply double up, and I don't have to worry, because if he takes, I just take back, and he doesn't have any follow-up checks, and my king is safe on d2. Meanwhile, I'm like threatening to take on g7 next move. Here my opponent plays rook f7, basically over defending, making sure I can never really take on g7, but I simply just continue putting more pressure. And here my opponent first trades my pieces off, because his knight is passive on h7 square, and my bishop is just putting more pressure. But I take back, and now I have a pawn looking at the g7 square as well. Basically, the pawn replaces the dark square bishop, and I still maintain the pressure. And after the trade happens on c3, my opponent tries to basically cheese me and infiltrate into my position and have counterattack and hopefully checkmate me. But he is a bit too late, because I just take on g7 now, and I do end up checkmating him. And in this position, if you look back, at this point as well, if I enable the engine, he's still losing. It's clearly bad for him, because now with the pawn, I am threatening to take on g7 and open up the position, and he honestly has no moves. And as I mentioned before, if my king was on c1, he would take on c3 with check and everything, but here my king is safe and I push forward. So to re-summarize, it's basically trying to develop your pieces to active squares and preventing your opponent from basically trading too much or activating his pieces. And then more importantly, you want to create some sort of pawn attacks and basically open up the position once your pieces are all developed, because without your pieces developed and ready to attack, there's no point in opening up your opponent's king, because that only gives him time to defend. And lastly, also, if your opponent ever creates weaknesses for himself, like in this game he played f6, be sure to take advantage of him immediately or later, depending on how the development of your pieces is going. So that's it for today's video, and hope to see you next time.